On today's episode of This American Life, we'll be talking with dead people. My agent, Ralph Waldo Emerson, has put a lot of time into getting these ghosts to interview with us. They'll be discussing their definition of an American and how it affected them while they were living. They will share their regrets and offer advice for Americans who also think they know the definition of what an American is. I've always said, be yourself, not your idea of what you think someone's idea of yourself should be. But let's see what these ghosts have to say about that.
I don't got a huge old house, I rent a room in the house. Listen, baby, girl, I ain't got a motor boat, but I can float your boat. So listen, baby. Drive through Bronx, hell, I don't care. I'm still real, no matter how many records I sell.
So Gatsby, what's your definition of an American?
Well, Henry, I have two definitions of an American. One I discovered after death, which differ greatly from my definition while living. When I was alive, I tried to live up to being a wealthy, successful, and well-educated man. However, my parents hadn't instilled this in me. I had a modest upbringing, perhaps too modest. When I was but 17 years old, I saw something that would change my life forever, Dan Cody's yacht. It represented all the beauty and glamour in the world, and from that moment on, I strived to have what Dan Cody had, a successful and ambitious life. Winning Daisy's affection became one of my top priorities. Her voice was full of money, and she was the ultimate prize in my eyes. In order to be good enough for her, I changed my name, became involved in illegal business, and lied about my past.
You said you had two definitions. How did this change?
I was blinded by the false expectations of what I thought an American should be, and in striving to become an American, I was never more miserable. I lost touch with my parents, my past, and my true self. My death was premature. I took the blame for Daisy, who had hit Myrtle with my car, in hopes that she would leave Tom for me. Ultimately, she never bothered to call or even come to my funeral. I still don't know what the exact definition is, but it's definitely not what I imagined while living. I realized that my death could have been prevented if I only knew what I do now. I learned the hard way that I was living a lie.
Thank you for talking with us, Mr. Gatsby.
My pleasure, Henry, and please, call me James Gatz.
I'd now like to welcome the ghost of Bigger Thomas. For those who don't know, Bigger was unfortunately murdered by his jailmate in 1939. Now let's see what he has to say.
Thank you, Mr. Thoreau. Happy to be here.
When you were alive, did you live by Gatsby's expectations of an American?
Well, I always wanted to be rich and support my family, but I knew that wasn't in the cards for me.
And why would you think that?
Because of the color of my skin. I knew that by just being in Mary's room, I would be guilty of rape. All my life, I've seen African Americans struggle. I lived in a rundown apartment that was infested with rats. The white realtor, Mr. Dalton, owned my apartment building, but didn't do anything to improve the terrible conditions. Sometimes I felt like he kept our living conditions poor on purpose, to keep us feeling inferior to whites. I grew up in the poor African American section of Chicago and was raised to believe that there was an equal opportunity.
Did this mindset lead you to success or failure?
Falling into society's expectations and stereotypes for an African American led me directly to failure. I believed that I would accomplish very little in life just because of my race. I was blinded by the idea of my inferiority, which caused me to act as a stereotypical African American boy. People always thought that I was a threat to society, but all I ever wanted was acceptance and equal opportunity. Living up to society's expectations was my ultimate downfall because it led me to fear and violence. I know I wouldn't have murdered Mary if I had not been so afraid in her room that night. I knew that just by being in Mary's room, I would be guilty of rape.
Now that you have newfound wisdom, do you still believe in your definition of an American?
No, sir. I had it all wrong. I shouldn't have lived up to other people's stereotypes and instead focused on doing the best I could for my family. My biggest regret is leaving them with no source of income.
Thank you, Bigger, for opening up to us and helping Americans discover who they are, not who they should be. Next, we'll hear from Edna Pontellier as well as John Proctor. Unlike Gatsby and Bigger, Edna and Proctor risked rebelling against the common expectations of society in order to be themselves. I have always known that there is no definition of an American. People such as Gatsby and Bigger never realized this. Others, such as Edna and Proctor, realized that there was no definition, but unfortunately it was too late for them. Edna discovered her own meaning of life, but was never able to truly escape from the tight grasp of Creole culture. Let's see if she can shed some light on this matter.
So Edna, let's start with the definition of an American based off your society.
I knew that the expectations society had for me were based off Creole culture. I was expected to be a devoted, faithful, and caring wife and mother. I had to follow a strict schedule, all to keep up with appearances. A divorce was unheard of in Creole culture.
And how did this definition shape you, Edna?
Well, I tried for years to keep up with that way of life. However, let's face it, I couldn't conform. I knew from the start I preferred being independent. It drove me crazy listening to other women talk openly about being perfect wives and mothers while I kept to myself, hating the life that I was living. I resented my husband Leonce more and more each day. I couldn't be with other men without Leonce growing suspicious. I loved being with Robert because he made me feel as though a chain had loosened. While trying to live up to these expectations, I found myself drifting further and further away from who I wanted to be. I was at the end of my rope.
So what did you decide to do about that?
I rebelled against the stereotypical definition of an American and lived up to my own ideals. When society wouldn't allow me to do this, I freed myself in the only way that I knew how. I let the waters take me away.
And so, what would you say became your new definition of an American?
That's up to the individual. You see, society can't tell you how to live. That's something you must choose yourself.
It's a gift that you've realized this, but it's a shame that society's hold was too strong for you to handle.
It's not often that people come to this realization during their lives because many people are blinded by society's expectations and are forced to wear a mask. Like Edna, John Proctor also came to this realization during his lifetime. John Proctor has graced us today with his ghostly presence.
John, what do you think about Edna's ideas of what an American is?
I had similar beliefs to Edna in that we both grew up thinking we had to follow the traditional path in our respective societies. In Salem Village, I was expected to be an extremely religious, conservative, and faithful husband and father. I believed in God, but not to the extent that it would control every aspect of my life. I think that being an American is living up to one's own standards. In jail, people all around me lied to save themselves, while others like Rebecca Nurse and myself stayed true to ourselves. We decided not to sin by confessing to something that we didn't do. In my eyes, it was our different opinions that made us Americans. I myself went back and forth with making the decision, but ultimately decided that my dignity was most important. Despite this, I could see why others chose to lie, for their family's sake.
Do you regret following your own definition of an American?
No, not in the least. In living up to my own ideals, I believe I have left a lasting impression on Salem Village. I strongly believe if I hadn't spoken out against the court, many more innocent people could have been killed. If it wasn't for people like myself who marched to the beat of their own drum, people like Edna would not have thought to break away from their traditional roles. Although many people in my society viewed me as an immoral rule breaker, I believe that I was a model American citizen. Like you, Henry, I saw something that needed to change and took the necessary steps toward a solution. I sacrificed my life because it was the only way to bring attention to the issue in Salem Village. Paying the price of my life doesn't bother me because I knew if I had given up my dignity and confessed, I would not have been a good father to my children or husband to my wife. Therefore, I have no regrets. My wife even said in my dying hour, "He have his goodness now," which in my eyes seems like an approval of my decision.
So looking back on your life, would you say you have the same definition of an American now?
I was raised to go to church every Sunday and always be devoted to my wife and children. I felt as though the church was controlling my life, which caused me to rebel against the definition of the person that I was expected to be. I therefore cheated on my wife and stopped going to church. I'm not proud of what I've done in that aspect, but in doing so, I was able to discover my own meaning to life. By not conforming to my society's expectations, I was able to come to terms with my sins and find forgiveness within myself.
Thank you very much for your insight, Mr. Proctor. I couldn't agree more.
Gatsby, Bigger, Edna, and Proctor all thought that they knew what the definition of an American was while living. Edna and Proctor were fooled at first by society's expectations, but were able to free themselves and live according to their own standards. Unfortunately, Gatsby and Bigger did not make this discovery during their lifetime and wished they had the wisdom that they acquired after death. None of these ghosts can quite put their finger on what the actual definition of an American is, and there is good reason for that, because there is absolutely no definition of an American. Today, some common misconceptions are obese, hardworking, ungrateful, and proud. The thing is, there is not one adjective applicable to all Americans. People should be themselves, not who they think others expect them to be. From now on, I hope that the viewers of This American Life understand that the show is not meant to define an American. Its purpose is to show that we are all categorized as Americans, but every individual leads a completely different life. Catch you next time on This American Life.